everybody, welcome to my new channel, The Eclectic Reader. So for the past few years, I've actually had a Booktube channel called The Francophile Reader where I talked about French literature, both modern and pre-modern. Because in my day-to-day life, I am a PhD student in French and Francophone studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Though I no longer live in Philadelphia, I now live in Arizona. And I work on the Renaissance Reformation, so that's 16th century literature. And my dissertation, or thesis, for all of you outside of the United States, looks at narratives of martyrdom in France and Geneva. Now, this is not a topic that I've talked about very much on my other channel, but my other channel, even though it was a Booktube channel, it wasn't very much a traditional Booktube channel. So it was more educational. I tended to introduce people to French literature, and it is something that I will continue to do on the Francophile Reader. But I have very eclectic reading tastes. Before I decided to do a PhD in French, I actually was very interested in biology, and I actually got a degree as an undergrad in French and in biology, and did 1 year of a PhD in entomology, which, yes, is the study of insects. So I also read a lot of books about biology, about animals particularly. I'm very, very interested in the science of conservation in North America, and I have been reading a lot of books about that. In addition, I like to read genre fiction, books that have come out in the last 50 years. I have been very recently interested in historical mysteries, particularly mysteries set in the pre-modern, early modern periods, but I'm also interested in historical mysteries set in the modern day that look back on maybe art pieces from the pre and early modern periods. So I read very widely, and I wanted the Eclectic Reader to be a more traditional Booktube channel. Now, just as with the Francophile Reader, I will not be making book haul videos. I don't like really watching book haul videos, and so I don't really want to make them. And I don't really do TBRs because being an eclectic reader, I tend to read whatever it is I want. So to give you an idea of how eclectic my reading tastes are, I thought I'd talk about the 13 books that I have read so far this year from cover to cover. These are the books that I listed on Goodreads, because on Goodreads, I always give star ratings for everything I read. I don't necessarily write written reviews. That's what I do on my blog, Exploring Literature, which I will link below, along with my other channel, The Francophile Reader. But I wanted to talk about some of the books that I have read, actually all 13 books that I've read this year from cover to cover. I read a lot more than that, mostly articles, which is why I've only read 13 books. Most booktubers read way more than 13 books. But here are the books that I've read. So the first book that I read, I actually have with me, which is in French, Histoire de l'exécution de Cabrières et de Mirandol et d'autres lieux de Provence. This is an academic book, a book that really only maybe a handful of people have ever read. So Jacques OBrien was a lawyer who in the 16th century served as prosecutor for a trial related to a massacre of a Christian sect known as the Waldensians. My research looks at religious violence, narratives of martyrdom, so religious violence. And this is a series of speeches he gave condemning the leader of the massacre, Jean d'Oppede. It is in French. This is an edition edited by Gabriel Odizio. It's not available in modern French. I think he kind of modernized the spelling of some of it. He goes back and forth as an editor. Some of the editions he has made, he has kept the original French spelling. Some of it, he has modernized the spelling. But anyway, give you an idea of how odd my reading can be because of my research. Then I read The Reformation by Dermot McCulloch. If you want a 1-volume, fairly comprehensive introduction to the Protestant Reformation, and actually the Catholic Reformation and the Anabaptist Reformations as well, this is the book to get. I'm sure there are other books you could get. You could probably also get Reformations by Carlos Ayer, but The Reformation by Dermot McCulloch is a fantastic 1-volume introduction to the Reformation. Highly recommend. And actually, I encountered some texts that were mentioned that have come in handy for me in my research. Then I read Darwin's Ghost, The Secret History of Evolution by Rebecca Stott. And Rebecca Stott looks at the books that Darwin cited as influences in the publication and the development of On the Origin of Species, his theory of evolution by natural selection. And it was interesting. There were certain scientists that she examines that I felt were probably more relevant to Darwin's work than others. For example, the first chapter is on Aristotle. Aristotle was not an influence on Darwin, even though Darwin ended up saying that Aristotle was an influence. He had actually been mistaken. He got this information from a friend who had misattributed a certain discovery to Aristotle. But actually, Aristotle's teleological view of the animal kingdom is definitely not at all compatible with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So that one is there because Darwin cited Aristotle, but actually Aristotle is not as much an influence as, say, Diderot, who was a philosopher in the 18th century. He was an Enlightenment philosopher, and Diderot actually had some proto-evolutionary ideas, which I remember reading when I was reading Diderot's works as a master's student. So that was a great chapter. There were also a few other chapters that were more engaging than others. I do recommend it, but maybe not as much as some of the other books that I will be talking about. And then I read The Ice at the End of the World by John Gertner. The Ice at the End of the World is about the discovery of Greenland by European explorers. It's about the early days of exploration into the heart of Greenland. And I mean, these explorers, they risked their lives. In some cases, they just died. They lost limbs. It was extremely, extremely dangerous. And it's really interesting to see how Greenland eventually became what we know it to be as an important scientific center for the study of global warming, where the study of glaciers occurs. Of course, there are people who also live in Greenland, and of course there were indigenous people who lived in Greenland. I wish that Gertner had talked more about the indigenous people. They are mentioned here and there when they help the Norwegian explorers, but I would have liked more emphasis on the indigenous people of Greenland. And then the next book is another academic book, maybe a little bit more accessible in terms of, it's in English, it's in modern English. It's a monograph. It's called Terrorism Before the Letter, Mythography and Political Violence in England, Scotland, and France, 1559 to 1642 by Robert Applebaum. So Robert Applebaum applies critical terrorism study to certain kinds of religious violence in the second half of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th centuries. And this was a fantastic book if you're interested in modern approaches to looking at religious violence. Again, it's religious violence. It's not for everyone, but I found it to be highly readable, and it introduced me to some very interesting martyr narratives written by Liger, who were these ultra-conservative Catholics in France who supported the assassination of two kings, Henry III and Henry IV. So there you go. I think that I'm going to be looking at some Liger pamphlets for my dissertation now. Then another academic book, Hatred in Print, Catholic Propaganda and Protestant Identity During the French Wars of Religion by Luc Racot. And this is about propaganda against Catholics and Protestant identity. It was very useful for my research, but again, I don't know if anyone is going to go out and get it. These books tend to be very, very expensive. So academic books aren't really bought by individuals. They tend to be bought by research libraries. So if you have access to a research library, you might want to check out some of these books. Otherwise, you probably won't be able to purchase them. They're very expensive. Then, my favorite author of historical mysteries, Ellis Peter. I read Monk's Hood, which is the third Brother Cadfael mystery. And I just love the Brother Cadfael mystery series by Ellis Peters. I have read about 5 of her books. I definitely like A Morbid Taste for Bones, which is the first book in the series. But my favorite of the books is The Heretic's Apprentice. I gave 3 stars to Monk's Hood. It was forgettable, and I remember kind of being frustrated with the reveal. I felt like there was political information that we were never given that was important at the very end. So I wish that had been given earlier. Then I read The Cabinets of Barney, Maine, which is a fairly recent publication, 2020, by Elsa Hart. I also gave it 3 stars. This one deals with a collector of curiosities named Barney, Maine, and there is a murder that occurs. Actually, he is the victim of the murder, Barney, Maine himself. And the character, this is in 18th century London, and our protagonist is basically trying to figure out what happened. It is more or less a cozy mystery, I would say. It's more of a historical cozy mystery, and I liked it, but again, I was kind of frustrated by the great reveal at the end. So there's that. Then one of my favorite books of the year was American Zoo, A Sociological Safari by David Grazian. David Grazian is actually a professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, but I got this book actually at the public library, which is great to see the public library actually purchasing academic books. American Zoo looks at the various political, sociological issues that come with zoos. Obviously, there are people who oppose zoos, but David Grazian himself was a volunteer at 2 zoos for 4 years, and then he had all of these teaching assistants who would do interviews at the zoo, which I would love to be his teaching assistant. This would be a great job. I would love to be able to interview particularly zookeepers who are predominantly women. And I just thought that this book did an excellent job in talking about all of the work that these women do to care for these animals. Of course, there are male zookeepers, but it is a female-dominated industry. And like all female-dominated industries, the workers are paid nothing. They're barely paid. In fact, to be a zookeeper, you start out as an unpaid volunteer. And these women do so much work. He also talks about the veterinary work and also, you know, the way, for example, the zoos promote conservation, where they're actually successful, but also what prevents them from maybe being as successful as they could be. For example, many American zoos are funded by ExxonMobil, Texaco. Companies that are actually responsible for global warming and for environmental disasters, BP. And yet they can't really speak about these oil companies and instead may focus more on poaching in Africa, for example, which is of course a real problem, or the exotic animal trade in China, real problems. But for a predominantly American audience, it's interesting the zoos cannot really focus as much on how the US contributes to global warming and environmental destruction. It's a fantastic book, highly, highly recommend, one of the best books I have read so far this year. Then I read a book that was also very useful for my research called Martyrdom and Memory, Early Christian Culture Making by Elizabeth Castelli. The approach that Elizabeth Castelli takes to the study of late antique, early Christian martyr narratives is essentially the approach that I am taking in my own research on 16th century martyr narratives. Basically looking at it in context. There's a lot of emphasis on rhetoric, which I love. I love the study of rhetoric, and I thought this was a fantastic book, gave it 5 stars. But again, it is an academic book, so you read it if you're interested in the making of culture, martyrdom, if you're interested in relics, in how individual deaths are transformed into martyrs. Then I read Wolves at Our Door, The Extraordinary Story of the Couple Who Lived with Wolves by Jim Dutcher. So I watch a lot of nature television, tons and tons of it. In fact, I probably have seen every single documentary that is available on any animal. I've seen everything on Netflix. I watch Animal Planet and Nat Geo all the time. And so I've always been interested in knowing how it is that filmmakers capture footage of very rare animals, or even of the American gray wolf. I'm not going to go into it too much because for some people they want this to be shrouded in mystery, but I wanted to know, and so I read this book. I know that this can be controversial, but for me, it seems to make sense, and I think the Dutcher is very convincing about why it is that these tactics are used to get the footage. It's really difficult to do so otherwise. This book, so part of the chapters are written by Jim Dutcher, and then part of them are written by Jamie Dutcher, who's his wife. I thought the chapters written by him were the best. But this was definitely a very interesting book for me. Then I read Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It by Chris Voss. I have very mixed feelings about self-help, but Chris Voss was a hostage negotiator for the FBI for so many years. And so this book about negotiation is written by someone with experience negotiating over literally people's lives. I thought that the tricks or kind of the skills that we need to when we enter into negotiation were really interesting. I have actually used some of them now, and I do recommend this book for anybody who has wanted to demystify negotiation in any kind of context. It doesn't necessarily have to be wage negotiation. It can be negotiation with your own family, with your friends. This is, I think, a really valuable book. Do listen to interviews with Chris Voss. He has a very charming persona, so you can understand why he was so successful as a hostage negotiator. And frankly, you have to be, because if you're not successful, people are killed. And he did have a few failures, so it is a very interesting book. These are lessons that you can take with you, and I do recommend this book. And then finally, I read The Raphael Affair by Ian Pierce. Ian Pierce is another historical mystery writer that I've wanted to read forever. Now, The Raphael Affair actually takes place in the 20th century when this book was written in the 1980s, and it follows partially Jonathan Argyll, who is a PhD student, I believe in art history, and he is convinced that a certain fresco that behind it is an original Raphael. But then he doesn't find it, and then there are some murders, and then there's arson, and basically it's this very short art history murder mystery. I really enjoyed it. I hope to continue with the series. And yes, I will be reading Instance of a Finger Post at some point, but it is a massive, massive historical mystery. So I wanted to start with a shorter work by Ian Pierce. So anyway, these are the 13 books that I have read so far this year, and you can see that they cover a wide range of topics. So that is what you can expect from me if you subscribe to my channel, The Eclectic Reader. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.